Alrighty, everyone, it is May the 31st, and over the last weekend, we have had some interesting news come out of Ukraine. A string of missile and drone attacks have happened over the weekend in both the Ukrainian capital and the Russian capital. This has raised concerns from international observers over a possible escalation in the conflict. Meanwhile, Russian media claims that the Russian Wagner mercenaries have been completely removed from the front line after they declared victory over the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut. With Russia's best military formation out of the fight, Ukraine was hoping to rest easy for a couple of weeks, but a new elite Russian unit has been spotted on the battlefield and has begun a new offensive against Ukrainian positions. The U.S. is upset at China over what they call a close and dangerous encounter between a U.S. spy plane and a Chinese fighter jet. China has responded by saying these encounters wouldn't happen if the U.S. didn't fly their spy planes so close to China. Meanwhile, in the small Balkan country of Kosovo, trouble has broken out in the form of riots, forcing NATO to reinforce their troop deployments to the region. All of this in today's Frontline report. Over the weekend, there was a rare Russian missile strike on Kyiv. The missile strike itself wasn't rare, but the manner in which it happened was. The Russians launched the first salvo of missiles in the late night to early morning hours while it was still dark. Ukraine, of course, began to discharge their air defense missiles, attempting to shoot down as many of the Russian cruise missiles as possible. What the Ukrainians didn't expect was as soon as daylight came, the Russians launched a second, rare daytime wave of missiles. Perhaps maybe at the time they thought the Ukrainian air defense was reloading. The missile raid was at least partially successful, with a high-value target being struck. But before we get too deep into the details, I would like to just remind everyone to please consider hitting both the like and subscribe buttons, actions that are totally free for you to do, but are a big help for me to grow the channel. Also, please consider hitting that bell icon so you do not miss the next update. And finally, a big shout out to those of you donating through the super chat feature in the comment section. It is all very appreciated. So, the building the Russians struck in Kyiv was actually the Ukrainian Ministry of Military Intelligence. This is a ministry that is playing a highly direct role in the Ukrainian war effort. Whether it reports on Russian troop movements, Ukrainian battle plans, or the choosing of targets deep behind the Russian lines, all of this information and more would pass through this building. The other notable thing here is that this is what you would consider to be a Ukrainian decision-making center. The Russians have been threatening to strike targets such as this for close to a year now, but never have. It was getting to the point where we all thought it was just another Russian bluff. It will be interesting to see if the strikes on similar facilities will continue. The Ukrainians, of course, are of a ferocious nature, and throughout the war, they have never just sat by and let events like this happen. The Ukrainians did fail at protecting the military intelligence building with a rather spectacular last-second miss from a Patriot missile that went into the river beside the ministry as it was being hit. But the story doesn't end there. The Ukrainians launched their own drone attack on the Russian capital of Moscow. Ukrainian manufactured drones packed with explosives and with a range of 800 kilometers, reigned over the Russian capital by the dozens. Russian air defense was able to intercept a few, but not all of them. Some of the drones headed for the Kremlin and the Russian presidential palace, while others struck apartment buildings or simply crashed into trees. It doesn't appear like Ukraine was able to strike any important targets in the city, but they did achieve what was likely a morale boost for their people. If they hit Ukraine, then Ukraine will hit them. Meanwhile, on the Ukrainian front, there is very mixed news. In terms of good news, the Ukrainian army will not have to fight against the Russian Wagner mercenaries for several weeks, as they have been replaced on the front by Russian regular army after they took over Bakhmut. The Wagner mercenary group is a very dangerous unit because it is full of hand-picked, highly skilled veterans of the Russian regular army. Wagner recruits specialists from the VDV, which is Russia's elite airborne unit, and from Russian Spetsnaz, which is their special forces. Yes, Wagner is basically the MBA of Russian killers. They're the best of the best, and they are well paid, so of course the Ukrainians are somewhat relieved that they are no longer on the front. However, there is a bit of bad news as well. The Chechens are back. Primarily part of regional Rosgvardia units, the Chechen Akhmat Special Forces are widely considered to be elite soldiers. This is partly due to a warlike culture and a recent history of war. There were many veteran fighters in Chechnya before the war started, and in the last year they have had some success. The Chechens were the primary force that finished off and surrounded Ukrainian Azov battalion in Mariupol, a battle for a city 5 times as large as Bakhmut and only half as long. Now, this is not to say that the Akhmat forces are superior to the Wagner units. Unlike Bakhmut, Mariupol was surrounded and reinforcements did not flow into the city every day. Nevertheless, these are hardened fighters, and they have now moved to what looks like at least 2 different locations on the front line. First, we will talk about the area around Siversk. Reports of an advanced team of Akhmat Chechens have come in over the last several weeks that these fighters pushed Ukrainian forces out of the industrial zone of Bilohorivka. But a new report is claiming that a big advance was made in the forests around Kreminna, which is slightly to the north of the Seversky Donetsk River. Russian forces are rapidly approaching the outskirts of a small town called Grigorovka, a fact that would put the town of Bilohorivka in a semi-encirclement if true. Now, for those pro-Russian trolls in the comments, this does not mean Bilohorivka will follow tomorrow. It is a small town, yes, but it's an excellent defensive position and already the site of one of Russia's biggest failed attacks of the war. Not to mention the Ukrainian troops in the area fight extremely well on the defensive. But this is a sign of where Russia's next target is. Russia is seeking to take Siversk. The second location that has been reinforced with elite troops is Marinka. The battle for Marinka, a small suburb of Donetsk, has literally lasted since day one of the war, essentially for 15 months straight. The Russians have made gains in this town, but it appears they will be looking to finish it off this summer. Lastly, a quick word about Avdiivka while we're looking at the front lines. It does appear that the Russians are attacking more frequently and with more resources in the area, but it is still unclear if Avdiivka will be the primary Russian target in the coming weeks. But it is certainly a position Ukraine will fight hard to keep. In terms of international news, there is a fascinating diplomatic spat between the U.S. and China. The U.S. military has accused a Chinese fighter pilot of an unnecessarily aggressive maneuver during an intercept over the South China Sea last week, which forced a U.S. RC-135 plane to fly through its wake turbulence. In an event that happened in December, the U.S. military claims that another Chinese J-16 fighter jet actually came within 20 feet of a U.S. aircraft, which was actually a reconnaissance or spy plane that was flying in the South China Sea, a territory that China claims national sovereignty over. The recent encounter was rather close, and it did produce some turbulence for the U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, but was nowhere near the danger close level of 20 feet. While it is probably not a stretch for the Chinese to claim the U.S. aircraft was actively spying on the Chinese military, it is not something that can be proven definitively. However, the U.S. aircraft was flying over international waters while in accordance with international law, treaties that the Chinese government have signed and agreed to in the past. The troubling fact here is that a similar and much worse situation actually occurred in the recent past. On April 1st, 2001, a Chinese pilot flying a J-8 fighter jet off the coast of Hainan Island, which is also pictured here in the screen, crashed into a U.S. EP-3E intelligence aircraft. Both planes were lost, the Chinese pilot was killed, and the American crew survived but was picked up and detained by the Chinese military. The U.S. accused China of violating international law, which was true, and China accused the U.S. of spying on mainland China, which was also true. Just as the consequences of the event were starting to settle with the public and the relationship between the U.S. and China was beginning to sour, the 9/11 terror attacks occurred. This did a lot to diffuse the situation at the time, but it is still concerning that 20 years later, neither country has changed their behavior. Hopefully, this does not lead to a repeat of the 2001 Hainan incident. Finally, the last topic we will touch on is Kosovo. The small territory which half the world sees as an independent country and the other half sees as nothing more than a breakaway territory of Serbia has had rising tensions ever since the start of the war in Ukraine. The region is primarily populated by Albanians, but there are several towns and pockets of ethnic Serbians spread throughout the region. The largest of these pockets is in the northern corner of the region. Recent elections took place for several mayoral positions in Kosovo. Serbians decided to boycott the vote, which easily handed the electoral victories over to the Albanian candidates. But when the new Albanian mayors tried to move into their offices, they were met with riots. Soldiers of the NATO KFOR force were forced into a riot control role and had to take up positions to allow the Albanian mayors to enter their offices. Reports suggest that around 24 soldiers were injured in the riots, primarily from Italian and Hungarian KFOR contingents. Currently, there are around 3,700 NATO troops stationed in the region of Kosovo, with new calls from military circles in Brussels to reinforce the contingent with another battalion of around 700 men. This is a huge diplomatic setback in a very volatile region. Just recently, Serbian President Alexander Vučić and Kosovo Prime Minister Albin Kurti had held talks to normalize relations, which is a big step, and these talks were mediated by the EU. Now the politicians are flinging accusations at one another for causing the escalation that has led to violence and ultimately both Serbs and Albanians being injured. All right, guys, that is it from me today. Thank you for joining, and until next time.